Already in the writing of Aristotle, we have the stated concern that a small number of people controlling more and more of the wealth that exists within that society is a problem for democracy, is bad for democracy. In fact, in Aristotle, we even get reflections on the extent to which this is a problem for aristocracy. This is a problem for oligarchy and monarchy. It's a problem for any possible organization of society as he understood it. And he tried to survey all the different ways to organize the society, all the examples that were available to him in the history of the world as he knew it. If we begin the discussion this way, already we're questioning the elimination of the billionaire class for reasons radically different from those that are familiar from socialists and communists. I am not a socialist. I am not a communist. On the contrary, I'm actually anti-communist. However, I share with Aristotle this fundamental concern about extreme wealth in our society. I share an interest in eliminating billionaires from our society, partly for the welfare of those billionaires themselves, believe it or not, partly in terms of questioning the future of wealth and what's good for democracy, what's good for our society as a whole, as stated, as something that can really be examined separately from the future of poverty. This is a really rare example of a video in which I did more than one take. I like to keep my videos unscripted and spontaneous, and almost every single video on this channel is take one with no edits, no modification. It's uploaded on that basis. But in this case, I'm struggling to get across in a non-hostile, non-aggressive way the idea there is a compelling argument for the elimination of the billionaire class that is not based on socialism. I'm not a socialist. That is not based on communism. I'm not a communist. I'm an anti-communist. And it is not even based on egalitarianism. It's not even based on an argument for helping the poor. On the contrary, the concept of helping the poor can really be a strange distraction from what the real issues are when we're talking about the future of wealth in our society, the function of wealth in our society, and the reasons for why we should and must, in my opinion, eliminate the billionaire class. Do you think there's a qualitative difference between living in a society where one man owns all of the land and where 10,000 people own small plots of land? Maybe you've never thought this through before, but in France, there's a famous wine-growing region of agriculture in Bordeaux. When you go there, what you find is that the land is not owned by one man. The land is not owned by one corporation, and it's not really organized, in the way that having a central owner would organize things. Instead, you see tiny little plots here and there, each one owned by a different family. And even though some of those families are millionaires, some of them are billionaires. The Rothschild family is there, a famous wealthy family in the history of Europe. The Rothschild family is there farming wine, but they have their own little tiny plot. And then some distance away, there's another little tiny plot. And the two guys, like they're cousins or brothers, different branches of the family. And each family is focused on making the best use out of their own tiny plot of land. Right? Now, would the quality of wine be improved if just one man owned all that land? If just one corporation or just one family, like the Rothschild family, bought the whole wine-growing region and consolidated control, and reorganized, maybe they could reorganize it to be more efficiently used, have just one tractor instead of each family owning its own tractor and this kind of thing. There would be some efficiencies of scale. You have to admit, if just one family or just one corporation owned that whole farming district, but something else would change. And that's what I'm trying to draw your attention to in this argument in this video, because it's actually not that easy to perceive what the problem is with centralization of control, centralization of ownership, right? And if you really understand the history of socialism, history of communism, the criticism I'm making here applies both to the billionaire class in a capitalist society and also to a communist dictatorship, right? Because under communism, that's exactly what would happen also. You'd have one owner, you'd have one corporation, if you like, reorganizing the land. It would just be a landlord, an owner, a corporation that calls itself the people's wine growing monopoly or the people's agricultural monopoly, taking over that reason and driving out, destroying small plot farmers, small landowners. Okay, it's natural for people to think about this problem in terms of distributing wealth to the poor, but that's actually quite a dishonest, unreasonable distraction from the real issue here. That's why this is so hard to articulate. At my university in Canada, probably at your university, wherever you are in the United States, Europe, around the world, the president of the university is paid a huge amount of money. If you add up salaries and benefits, the president, the executive level, the professors at the very top, they are quite likely earning at your university more than $1 million per year. Maybe you go to one unusual university where it's only $500,000 per year. You would be surprised. There is this cultural assumption that the president of the university, the executive level people at the university earn huge salaries. Okay? If your argument is that by paying the president less, you would help the poor, then that argument is false, right? It's just not the case that if the president of the university, if his salary is reduced from $1 million a year to $100,000 a year, it's not the case that $900,000 would then be given to starving people. It's just not true. Now, what would happen to the $900,000? Well, there is an achievable goal here of having a university where instead of one man earning $1 million, you have 10 professors who are each earning $100,000. That's attainable. That's possible, right? And maybe those 10 professors, or maybe you have 100 professors who to a greater extent share the executive responsibilities or the executive power, reflecting their more even distribution of wealth. None of this is about helping the poor. All of these professors are wealthy people. What we're talking about is the organization and function of the wealthy class. We're talking about the future of the wealthy in society. We're not talking about helping the poor. But there are many other things fundamentally that change here, right? A word that probably didn't pop into your head before when we were talking about the wine growing region of Bordeaux, of having one owner versus many small plot owners. A word that probably didn't pop in your head was innovation. Innovation and experimentation. When you have many small landowners owning many small parcels of land, and they all care about making the most out of that land, making that most out of their opportunity. Okay? There is more innovation, there is more experimentation going on overall this scale, as opposed to just one man, just one corporation controlling it all. And I think it is easy to imagine that if a university fires its president, says, forget it, we're going to fire you. Now we have $1 million that we saved by firing you. And we're not going to hire one person. Instead, we're going to hire 10 people, pay them all $100,000. Of course, you would have more innovation. Like conceptually, there's a certain amount of farmland this university has, and they're giving it to more farmers, right? So the issue here really isn't the alleviation of the poor. The issue here isn't the question of how charitable our society is towards the poor. It's a question more to deal with qualitatively and quantitatively. What use do we make of our wealth in the sense of our country as a whole, our society as a whole? What is the social function of that wealth? And the distribution of opportunity. When more people have opportunity, then there's more experimentation and more innovation going on, visibly and invisibly. It's not a simple question of oppression versus liberation, and it's not a question of feeding starving people. Those are important questions too, but those really have to be dealt with quite separately here. When I was a boy, maybe 11 years old, maybe 13 years old, I think it was about 11, I met a man who owned more land within England than the total area of Israel. All right, so as a boy, that was hard for me to visualize. Well, okay, this one guy, he owns land within England the size of Israel. That was what he said. And he had a whole story about, his family, they weren't aristocrats, but they ended up buying land from this aristocrat who went bankrupt. It was an interesting story, how he came into this. And most people in England who lived on or around this land he owned, they assumed that it was like a national park because the vast majority of the land he used was wasteland. Rocks and hills and shrubs and trees. There's nothing being farmed, there's nothing being used. Now, he happens to own the land, but people go hiking on this land and they just imagine it's a national park, right? What would happen if we took his land and we divided it into 1,000 parcels and we gave that to 1,000 people? Let's say you in the audience. Let's say 1,000 people watch this video, and each one of you is going to get a small plot of land somewhere in England that could be used for some kind of farming purpose. You could use it for an ecological purpose. You could start running it like a park, wildlife park, or animal refuge. You could do anything you want with it, okay? By distributing that opportunity so that more people have an opportunity, you're going to have more innovation. You're going to have more experimentation, right? This one guy owns this land and he does nothing with it. Or, even if it's a corporation that farms wheat, they just farm wheat. And they farm wheat the same everywhere, right? That's how that corporation does it. When 1,000 people own the land in separate small plots, one of you is going to say, hey, cranberries. England has no history with farming cranberries. That's something we do in Canada, in Ontario. You know what? I think the climate here works. I think the land I got works for cranberries. I'm going to try farming cranberries. Another one of you will have taken a vacation in South Korea. And you notice, you know what? The Koreans, they really have a culture of taking some of these root vegetables and making them marketable, making them delicious in a certain way. Currently here in England, these types of root vegetables aren't worth any money. Maybe I can take those Korean techniques and I can try doing them here and I can try to make it profitable. People are going to buy these vegetables if I prepare them in a more of a Korean way, but that appeals to the local market or something. There's going to be experimentation and innovation, and people don't think of agriculture in terms of experimentation and innovation, but this is really important. And there's also that qualitative dimension I've already described or alluded to, of just how much you care, because this is your plot of land. This is your opportunity, right? So you want to make the most of it. You want to do the best you can. There is a qualitative difference in our society as a whole between one billionaire who owns 1,000 apartment buildings and is collecting rent from all of those apartment buildings every month, and having 1,000 different millionaires. Each one owns just one apartment building. Okay? Yes, there's an element of innovation. There's an element of different apartment buildings are going to try to be appealing or make the best of their situation the best they can. But there's also just fundamentally this question of the ethic of care. Donald Trump's father was a billionaire. He's deceased now. He owned a huge number of apartment buildings all over America. He's collecting rent on all of them. Okay? His attitude is going to be completely different from someone who owns just one building. This is my building. I've got to care about how well it's maintained and how well it's run and how happy the residents are. I've got to care about this in this intense and focused way. All right. We have a better university when we have more professors who are earning $100,000 as opposed to the one president earning $1 million. We have a better society when we have a landlord class that's more divided up this way, even if we're talking about a division between many millionaires. We're not talking about helping the poor. If you divide this up, again, fundamentally, it's just as much of a delusion to say we're going to help the poor by paying the president of the university less. It's just as much of a delusion to say we're going to help the poor by paying your landlord less. If you live in an apartment building or a condominium tower that's owned by one of these massive corporations, but we're going to make our whole society better in this way that's difficult to trace, that's difficult to pin down, if instead we have 1,000 millionaires controlling 1,000 separate apartment buildings, as opposed to one billionaire or one multi-billion-dollar corporation that controls all of the apartment buildings. This critique has existed since Aristotle. Already in Aristotle's time, we lived in a society where there were two classes of men. There were people who paid rent, and there were people who collected the rent. As long as the landlords are collecting rent, even if the people paying rent aren't poor, they may be middle class, they may be wealthy. Some of them, though, are going to be the poor getting poorer. As long as the landlord class is collecting rent, then they are getting richer and richer and richer until you get this kind of extreme inequality within the rich, where you could, in theory, have one billionaire who owns all of the apartment buildings in your whole country, who's collecting rent from everyone. Everyone else is paying rent, and one person is profiting by it, right? Everyone buys cell phones, cellular phones, and there's one man who owns the factory that manufactures those cellular phones. That one man, the man who manufactures the iPhone and most of the other high-end, expensive cellular phones, the one man who owns that corporation, he stood for election here in Taiwan in the last election. Everyone knew this guy is just such a multi-billionaire. He just has so much money. The question is, will he buy the election? He dropped out. Right now in the United States, you have a multi-billionaire, and the question is, will he control the Democrat primary? But there's a broader question, right? Aristocratic societies exist by and for the aristocratic class, all right? Societies dominated by billionaires exist by and for the billionaire class, even if they don't get elected directly, right? Indirectly and ineluctably, they have a weight and presence in this culture, all right? And in a country like Canada, you really can have a situation where there's one family that controls all of the pulp and paper industry, and there's one family that controls all of the washing machines. That used to be the case in Canada back before we had free trade and they had competition coming from outside, where there's one family that got fantastically rich from agricultural equipment like tractors and so on and so forth, where, it's not quite as extreme yet as one family that collects rent from everyone. But it can, especially in smaller economies, it can become that unequal. It can become that bad, sector by sector, when you look across the economy. And you can't see the opportunity and innovation that's snuffed out by this centralization of power and ownership by just one man or just one family or just one corporation. You can't see that the farming regions of Canada could be as innovative, as high quality as the farming regions of France, where there are all these little small plot farmers who are passionately committed to making the most of it. You can't see that when one giant corporation like Cargill just owns this huge amount of land and farms it for one purpose in one uniform way, paying people absolute minimum wage. When you take away that element of engagement and responsibility and care and the potential for innovation, you can't see what's missing, right? You can't see the absence. You can't see the way in which our whole society is corrupted by the role that the billionaire class currently plays. You can see the success of the Disney Corporation. What's harder to see is how much better our whole culture would be, how much more vibrant our whole democracy would be if it were divided up into, say, 8 smaller corporations. Don't believe me? Think it through. Right now, there is a Walt Disney theme park on the West Coast, California, and there's a Walt Disney park on the East Coast in Florida. What if, instead of striving for uniformity, what if they were really innovating separately and each was competing against the other? They divided their intellectual property, their rights. What if those two were separate rival corporations making different kinds of films and different kinds of attractions at their theme parks. Wouldn't the world be a better place? It would be, and it would be a better place in a way that has absolutely nothing to do with helping the poor. That's what's so interesting about this. We're talking about reorganizing the wealthy in society, reorganizing the wealth of society so that we can have a better democracy, which is also Aristotle's concern, right? Aristotle was not a socialist, he was not a communist, right? Even though the type of qualitative change, the type of quantitative change here, it wouldn't take money away from a billionaire and hand it to a starving homeless person. That is, in a fascinating way, irrelevant to this question of why we should, why we must eliminate the billionaire class